Welcome to Lessons from the Playroom. In this podcast, Lisa Dion will help you explore the little things that make a big difference in play therapy. Lisa is the founder of Synergetic Play Therapy. You know, sometimes therapists get all caught up trying to study big theories and mastering techniques to help children like me. But sometimes it's the little things we show you along the way that make the biggest difference. Join Lisa as she teaches you some of the little lessons that children are trying to communicate to you so that you can help us in the best ways possible. And on behalf of all the kids you work with, thanks for listening and believing in us. Let's get started.
Hi listeners, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in and joining me for this next conversation in the Lessons from the Playroom podcast series. We are going to be talking about death in the playroom today. I talk a lot and I teach a lot about how to work with aggression and how to work with intensity. And one of the topics that is within that is the topic of death in the playroom. And it can actually be pretty confusing. And I think more than confusing, it can feel complicated to work with. And I want to talk a little bit about why it can be challenging for us when death shows up in the playroom, whether we are observing it or we are participating in that play itself. So maybe, for example, we are dead in the play, or we are asked to have something else become dead in the play, or who knows what, but we're either the ones that are causing the death in the play, or we're the ones that are dead in the play, or we're observing the death in the playroom. It can actually be really intense inside of our own nervous system, and I want to talk a bit more about that and about why, and to offer some ideas and some support around that. Now, everything that I'm going to talk about is an extension of the conversation that I have in my Aggression in Play Therapy book. So if you don't already have that book, it's a great resource for working with intensity, whether it is aggression or whether it's death like in our conversation today. Also want to share with you that the book has now been translated into Spanish, if that is useful for you, or if you know another clinician that does speak Spanish, it would be useful to have it translated into Spanish. And the book is also available in audio format if you are the type of individual that would rather listen than to read. And I am the reader, so you get to hear me reading and sharing the stories and the content in the book. So just offering that up for you as a resource before we begin this particular conversation. So let's just talk about how death shows up in the playroom. And let's talk a little bit about why it's important that we allow it to show up in the playroom. I've already talked about one of the ways that death shows up in the playroom, and that's in the play itself. So sometimes the child kills you in the play, or you have to kill something in the play. So that's one of the ways that it can show up. The other way is that the child kills something in the play or has something kill something else. So for example, there is a war scene in the sand tray, and whatever is at war with each other, there is death that occurs in that sand tray. Or there is a puppet that attacks another puppet and the puppet dies, or whatever. However it shows up that there is symbolically in the play itself, death emerges in the playroom. I want to remind you, if you find yourself really uncomfortable with death showing up in the playroom, I want to remind you that it's such an important piece to allow to enter the play process. Death is a part of life. Children experience and come in contact with death every single day of their lives. Whether it is simply the change of the seasons, whether it is the change of something dying, moving from one grade level to the next grade level, whether it is an actual loss of someone in their life, whether it is hearing about something on the news, reading a story about it. But death is part of life, and children come in contact with death literally, and then also symbolic endings and changes on a regular basis. And so it's really, really important that we recognize that we need to allow that to come into the play therapy experience so that they are able to work through it and to better understand whatever it is that they are trying to process. Now, sometimes death shows up in the playroom because there's been a literal death that the child is trying to process. So you may find yourself participating in a ritual around the loss. Maybe there's a recreation of a burial or a funeral or a ritual of some kind, honoring or even just, again, processing the fact that someone has passed away in this child's life. Maybe what you're processing is not so much a literal experience of that, but more the feelings around the loss itself. And so you may have feelings emerge in the playroom around out of control and things aren't fair and why do bad things happen, and the sadness and the anger and the confusion. And we know that there can be so many feelings associated with death and loss. Sometimes it's not about death literally, and it really is about a felt sense of there is a change or a loss of some kind. And so you are experiencing that in the playroom. And sometimes it's the way that the child plays in order to give you a felt sense of the hypoaroused activation of their autonomic nervous system. So, for example, as there is death in the room, maybe you are lying on the ground and you're not able to move, and you are, because you are in a position of death, so to speak, you are having to feel the felt sense of the hypo-aroused, I can't do anything, I'm too weak, there's no one here to help me, I just want to curl up and protect myself. I want to disappear. I want to go away. So sometimes it's the felt sense of the activation of the hypoaroused response of the autonomic nervous system. So I think that's important because sometimes I think that play therapists, we take the play really literally. And we forget that the child will bring to life in whatever way they need to give us that felt sense of what they're going through. And so sometimes that means that the play is literal, but sometimes it doesn't mean that it's literal. It's just what the child needs to do or the story they need to tell you to get you in touch with the feelings, the sensations, again, that activated felt sense that's the child is feeling deep inside that they're trying to get you to also attune with. So, however the death play is showing up in the room, the point is that it's important that we allow it to, because it's an important expression, it's an important place for the child to process and to be able to explore. Having said that, my personal experience and my experience with my students and having conversations with therapists is that when death is in the playroom, particularly when the therapist is the one that is being asked to die, that is such a challenging place to stay present and to be able to regulate through, because it creates such a deep sense of vulnerability. When we are not able to move, when we feel helpless, when we have our power, in a sense, taken away, it is so deeply vulnerable. And it really can touch in on some really internal, vulnerable places within the therapist. For a therapist that wants to be in control, that needs to feel like that they have some control, this type of play can be really hard, because this type of play asks the therapist to surrender and to feel and to stay present with the sensations and the emotions that are arising as that felt sense of death is being explored or that hypoaroused energy is being explored. So let's just start there. I want to give you some tips for staying present and regulating if you are asked to be dead in a session. So one of the challenging things about regulating when we are dead is that typically, we're not able to move because we are dead. So that's the first thing to understand, is that when you are asked to be dead, it's important that you are dead. So that means no talking, that means no moving, that means that you really are embodying the role that the client is putting you in. I years ago observed a video of a clinician where the child was attempting to kill the clinician. And so the client shot the clinician was dead in the play, and then the clinician sat right back up, tried to have a conversation. The child turned around, looked at her, and then went and shot her again. So the therapist fell, and then once again the therapist sat up, started to engage, and the client was like, "No, I need you to stay dead," and shot her again. And this happened like 5 times before the client actually had to amp up the play so that the therapist understood that it was important that she stay dead. So when you are asked to die in the play, stay dead. Now, your job is still to regulate. So from a synergetic play therapy perspective, when the death shows up in the playroom, and again, right now I'm talking about when we're the ones that are being asked to die. I'll talk in a minute about when we're observing death play, or maybe even if we are asked to kill something, because that can also be a very uncomfortable and very vulnerable place. So I will get to that in a minute. But as we are talking about our own experience of dying in the playroom, from a synergetic play therapy perspective, your job is still to hold the space as the external regulator. The client still needs your presence. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that your ability to feel the feelings that are arising, to feel that uncomfortableness that is arising in this type of play, to feel what is being activated in this type of play, while simultaneously staying connected to yourself, regulating your breathing, being able to find a way where you stay poised in the midst of the dysregulation, where you find a way to mindfully observe your own process and the process that's happening in the room, is one of the keys to allowing this type of play to integrate and for the child to heal. There's a story in the book that really brought this home for me. So I had a session with a little girl who in the play, she killed me, and I fell to the floor and I was lying there dead. And I fell in such a way where I could still peek and track what she's doing, which, by the way, is very important to still be able to track if you're able to. And what I observed was that she then turned her back to me and she spent some time looking at the different toys on my shelf. And then she went and spent time by herself in my sand tray. And she was just processing, moving the sand, placing some objects, but mostly just moving with the sand while she was in the activation of hypoarousal. The felt sense in the room, it was very, how can I describe it? There was a sadness in the room. The air was a bit thick in the room. There was some tension in the room. There was a real sense of heavy in the room. So here we are. She is trying to regulate and integrate in the sand while she has brought to life this felt sense of hypoaroused energy in the room, and I'm now lying here dead on the ground. So part of my responsibility as the external regulator was to do what I could to stay present with myself and to regulate. So what that meant was mindfully tracking my breath. It meant engaging in mindfulness practices while I was lying there. So bringing my attention to different parts of my body. It meant moving my body in subtle ways where she couldn't see the movement. So maybe it was internally squeezing my muscles, or moving. I can't quite remember if where my arms were. I believe that my head was located on one of my arms, in which case, just knowing what I do, I was probably trying to move my fingers in a particular way to try to bring some a little bit of activation, keep my system a little bit alert. But I'm doing things to stay with myself, to stay connected with myself. And that's really the key piece of this conversation. And I was able to do that really well for about 30 minutes. If you can imagine, I was dead for 30 minutes. And then after about that, well, my mind wandered, which is what happens sometimes. And as my mind wandered towards, what am I going to be making for dinner that night? I needed to run to the grocery store. Time to go through my grocery list. And some of you, as I'm saying this, I know you know what I'm talking about. And the most interesting thing happened. I shared with you that she had her back turned to me for those entire 30 minutes. The moment that I left her, the moment that I was no longer connected to myself and was no longer the external regulator, and my mind wandered, she actually turned around and looked at me. And when she turned around and looked at me, she walked over to me and then she kicked me. She did. She kicked me. She felt me leave her. That's why this is so powerful. That's why this discussion is so important. We are still, even in death play, I know there's the part of you that, particularly if the death play is after the result of a sword fight, or the play's intense, or you're tired, I know there's a part of you that says, oh, great, I get to rest. No. This is not time to rest. This is time to be quietly alert. This is time for you to hold attention in a different way, because the child still needs to borrow your nervous system. The child still needs your presence so that the child can keep integrating. Now, the same thing is true when you are observing the play. So let's say that you're observing a scene in the sand tray. Or let's say that you are observing there is play happening between puppets or dolls, and one of them is hurting another one, and someone dies, or one of the toys dies symbolically in the play. Well, again, I just keep wanting to use the word vulnerable because I want us to normalize this. It's vulnerable, right? It's vulnerable to watch it, because it feels real inside, even though our minds know that we're just watching play. But the sensation of it feels real inside. And if we've had losses, well, guess what? Observing the loss can touch in on those losses. So it's important that we are gentle with ourselves and that we recognize that death in the playroom activates our own experiences of death and loss in our own lives, which is why it's so much more important that we mindfully regulate, that we do what we need to do to stay present with what's arising in us so that we can hold space for what's arising in the client. Otherwise, there is a high probability that we will do something to try to change the play, shut it down, tell the child that they can't play like that, etc., etc. Now, as I'm saying this, one of the things that I teach that is so important, because even though we are talking about death and not aggression, it can be just as intense, but it's intense in a different kind of way, which means that we can be taken right to the edge of our window of tolerance. And part of being an external regulator is doing what you need to do to be able to stay on the edge and within your own window of tolerance. So if the death play is too much for you, you do get to set a boundary. It's important that you set a boundary, because if you don't and then you become emotionally flooded, well, your own protective patterns are going to enter the room, and that's what's going to be leading and guiding the session. And the child's not going to have your regulated aspect of your internal experience to grab hold of, which is what the client needs so they can move towards their own internal challenges and experiences that they're trying to work through. So, of course, it's important to set a boundary when it's about to be outside of your window of tolerance. In the Aggression and Play Therapy book, I talk about boundary setting, and I talk about it from the synergetic play therapy perspective and how to do it in a way where we're not shaming or shutting down the child's process. So if that's of interest to you, check it out. I've got a whole chapter on that also in the book. As you are observing the death play, another piece that I want to just remind us of in all of this is the idea or the concept in synergetic play therapy of the setup or the offering, which is that the child is going to do what they need to do to offer you the felt sense of what it feels like to be them. So when you are asked to observe death, I want you to keep that in mind. How might that be a part of the setup or the offering? And I'll give you a story just to put this into a perspective for you. So, what if the child was a witness to a death? If the child was a witness to a death, or the child found themselves in a helpless position as they were processing or trying to integrate that someone in their life was dying, or there was a loss that's happening, you might be asked to be a witness because that's what it felt like for the child. So you may be asked to observe this so that you get the felt sense of, I can't do anything about this. I can't make this stop. I don't know how to make this stop. I feel helpless. I feel vulnerable. I feel just so sad. And so just to keep that in mind, and then how do you work with that in the playroom? Do you name it? Do you just be with it and acknowledge it within yourself? But how do you work with that? Because I guarantee that if you're asked to witness the play, that there's a reason why you're being asked to witness the play, and that there's really important information there for you to feel your way through. I'm going to pause and take a breath here. So the last one that I want to talk about is when we are asked to do something that then translates into the death of something else. So if you in the play are asked to kill something, wow, what a vulnerable place to be in. I want to come back to what I just said. At any point, if play is ever outside of your window of tolerance, or you have a felt sense that what you are asked to do is not in some way helpful for the integration, or you feel like if you were to step into that place that you would be reenacting the trauma rather than integrating the trauma. I want to say again, that you're reenacting it instead of integrating it, then it's important to set that boundary. It's important to acknowledge and redirect in some way. Show me another way. Let's explore this a different way. But if at any point you are asked to participate in some way where you in a sense are the challenger, or you're asked to kill something or hurt something or whatever it is, and then there's the death experience there, it's important that you let the child lead. It's important that the child scripts it, and it's important that you go slowly and carefully, step by step through the process so that you aren't adding anything into these moments. And again, if at any point, it's important that you use your clinical judgment. At any point, if something about it does not feel therapeutic, if it feels like it's outside your window of tolerance, if you feel like you can't hold it, if you feel like that something needs to shift, please trust your instinct on that, trust your intuition, acknowledge and redirect the play in some way. So as we are starting to make our way towards wrapping up this conversation, I just want to highlight a couple things again. The first is that, again, the death, it may be a literal death that's being played out, but again, it can also be a symbolic representation of the hyper-aroused state of the nervous system. It can also be the way that the child is exploring loss and change that's occurring in their life. So let's keep that in mind when death play shows up. It's important that we acknowledge that it's often a part of the setup to let us know what it feels like to be helpless, unimportant, sometimes even just deeply rejected. It's important to feel, to regulate, to attune. It's important, like I shared in that story, the child still feels you. Even when you are lying there dead, the child still needs to borrow your nervous system. They still need your presence as they are working towards integrating their own dysregulation, their own experiences, and their own challenges in their life. When you are dead, however that shows up, or if you're observing the death play, mindfulness practices, use your breath, whatever you need to do to be able to feel it while staying connected to yourself is the key to being able to be the external regulator in those moments. I'll also say one last thing that I did not touch on, but I just want to normalize this, that sometimes when the hypoaroused nervous system is being activated, which is also the dorsal response of the nervous system, one of the challenging parts about it is that the system can start to shut down. It can feel a little numb. It can feel like you are collapsing. And that's part of why I'm saying it's important to regulate your breathing. It's important to find some ways to keep a little bit of movement inside your body, even if you're not able to outwardly express those movements. Sometimes naming the experience is helpful, but sometimes what you're actually tracking inside of you is the absence of an experience. So there can be a felt sense of, you're not feeling much because you're going numb. And just know that that's valid, and that can very much be a part of the experience. And to also be present with that, be present with the experience of the absence of sensation, the absence of emotion, because that's also very much one of the expressions of trauma that can show up in our nervous system. Listeners, hopefully there were some nuggets in there that are helpful for you. Hopefully there's some good reminders for you as you head into your work. By the way, everything I just said also translates through the computer if you're having a teletherapy session as well. If you need more on this, if you want a resource, please check out the book, Aggression in Play Therapy. Again, it's now available in Spanish, and it's also available on audio. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. I so very much appreciate you. Thank you for being a part of this part of my world and offering me the opportunity to be able to share some of the things that I've learned along the way, these little lessons that we learn in the playroom that can really help us and grow us as clinicians. And as always, take care of yourselves. You are the most important toy in the playroom. Until next time. For more information on our courses and our classes, please go to our website at synergeticplaytherapy.com and check out what we have available to you. And as always, remember that you're the most important toy in that playroom.